At 50 years old, I never imagined I'd find myself standing on a cold, dimly lit street corner with nothing but the clothes on my back and a few coins jingling in my pocket. The city's noise was relentless, cars honking, people rushing by, the occasional murmur of laughter from a group of friends. To me, it all sounded distant, like I was watching life from behind a glass wall. I had no home, no family to call, and no idea where I would sleep that night. The journey to this moment hadn't been sudden. It crept up on me, one small loss at a time, until everything I'd worked so hard for was gone. At first, it was just a setback, an unexpected layoff from the company where I had spent 20 years. I thought it was temporary. I told myself, "You'll find something else soon. Don't worry." But the job market wasn't what it used to be, and the weeks of unemployment turned into months. At first, I relied on savings to get by, but those ran out quicker than I anticipated. Then I had to sell my car to cover rent for a few more months. Eventually, the landlord's patience ran thin, and I was evicted. I remember standing outside the apartment building with my suitcase, feeling more lost than I'd ever felt in my life. Friends I thought I could count on started distancing themselves. Some didn't know how to help, while others simply didn't want to be around someone struggling. The few who stayed couldn't offer much more than kind words, and though I appreciated them, kind words didn't put a roof over my head. The shelter system was a world I'd never thought I'd enter. The first night I stayed in one, I barely slept. The air was heavy with despair, and the stories I overheard from others were heartbreaking. People talked about broken families, lost jobs, addictions, and illnesses. It was humbling to realize I wasn't alone in my struggle, but it was also terrifying to see how easily life could unravel. Days blurred into weeks as I tried to find work. I walked miles each day, clutching my worn-out sum and hoping for a chance. But interviews were scarce, and the rejection emails piled up. Employers seemed to look past me as if I were invisible. Maybe I was too old. Maybe I didn't fit the image they were looking for. Whatever the reason, the world felt like it had turned its back on me. There were moments when I wondered if this was it, if my life would always be like this. 50 years old, homeless, and forgotten by the world. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake on a thin mattress in the shelter or sometimes on a bench in the park, staring up at the stars and asking questions that had no answers. What had I done wrong? How had I ended up here? But even in the darkest moments, there were glimmers of light. Small acts of kindness from strangers reminded me that not everyone had given up on humanity. A man at a diner once paid for my coffee when I couldn't scrape together enough change. A woman passing by handed me a blanket on a freezing night. These gestures didn't solve my problems, but they gave me a reason to keep going. One morning, as I sat outside a library trying to stay warm, a volunteer from a local outreach program approached me. She handed me a flyer about a job training initiative and encouraged me to attend. At first, I was skeptical. What could a training program do for someone like me? But I had nothing left to lose, so I decided to give it a shot. Walking into that community center was one of the most humbling experiences of my life. The room was filled with people like me, individuals who had been knocked down by life but weren't ready to give up. The program offered workshops on everything from resume building to interview skills. It also provided a small stipend for attending, which was just enough to buy a few meals. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. The trainers didn't look at me with pity, they saw potential. They treated me with respect, and that simple act restored a piece of my shattered self-worth. As I began to rebuild, I realized that recovery wasn't just about finding a job or a place to stay. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had lost along the way, my confidence, my resilience, and my ability to dream about a better future. But recovery was far from easy. The program required commitment, and some days I felt like giving up. The temptation to sink back into despair was strong, especially when progress felt slow. But I kept showing up, kept putting one foot in front of the other, even when it felt pointless. One afternoon, after weeks of training, I got a call. A local nonprofit organization was looking for someone to assist with administrative work. The pay wasn't great, but it was a start. I remember sitting in that tiny office, dressed in the only clean shirt I had, and trying to hold back tears of gratitude when they offered me the job. But just when I thought things were turning around, life threw another curveball. A figure from my past resurfaced, bringing with them a mix of hope and uncertainty. It was someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who might hold the key to a part of my recovery I hadn't even considered. And just like that, I realized my journey was far from over. As I stood at the crossroads of my past and future, I knew that the choices I made in the days to come would shape the rest of my life. Would I have the strength to face my demons and embrace the opportunities ahead? Or would the weight of my struggles pull me back into the darkness? The answer, I realized, wasn't just about me. It was about the connections I was willing to rebuild, the risks I was ready to take, and the faith I could find not just in myself, but in others. As the city buzzed around me, I took a deep breath and prepared for the next step in my unexpected journey to recovery. The figure from my past was someone I never expected to see again. It was a face tied to memories I had buried deep, memories of a life that felt so far removed from my current reality that it almost seemed like it had happened to someone else. We locked eyes across the crowded community center, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if they recognized me. But then they hesitated, tilted their heads slightly, and began to walk toward me. It was an old friend. Well, maybe friend wasn't the right word anymore. We parted on bad terms years ago, over something that seemed trivial at the time but had grown into a rift we never managed to bridge. As they got closer, I could see the surprise on their face slowly shifting into something else, something I couldn't quite place. You, they said, their voice a mix of disbelief and caution. I didn't think. I mean, it's been a long time. I nodded, not sure how to respond. Words felt clumsy in my mouth, and I was suddenly very aware of my unshaven face, my worn-out clothes, and the weight of everything I'd been through. I wanted to disappear, to avoid the inevitable questions and the pity that often followed when people found out how far I'd fallen. But instead of pity, their expression softened into something that looked like concern. What happened? They asked quietly, their tone genuine. It was a simple question, but it felt like a punch to the gut. How could I possibly explain everything that had led me here in a way that made sense? How could I compress years of struggle, loss, and self-doubt into a conversation without breaking apart? I hesitated, then shrugged. Life, I said finally. It happened. They didn't push for more details, which I was grateful for, but I could tell they weren't satisfied with my vague answer. Instead, they sat down across from me, their presence both familiar and foreign. We talked, cautiously at first, like two people trying to navigate a minefield of unspoken history. As the minutes stretched into an hour, I found myself sharing more than I intended. Not everything, some wounds were still too raw, but enough to give them a glimpse of the road I'd been walking. To my surprise, they didn't judge me or try to offer platitudes. They just listened, their eyes heavy with an understanding that only someone who'd faced their own struggles could have. When they finally spoke, their words were careful, but direct. You don't have to do this alone, they said. I know it feels like the world's against you, but there are people who care. People who want to help. I wanted to believe them, but the walls I'd built around myself were thick. I had learned the hard way that relying on others often led to disappointment, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to risk that again. So I nodded politely and changed the subject, steering the conversation back to them. It turned out they'd been through their own share of hardships. While their story was different from mine, there were enough parallels to create an unspoken bond between us. They didn't offer solutions or try to fix me, and that made their presence feel less like charity and more like a lifeline I didn't know I needed. Before they left, they handed me a card. If you ever need someone to talk to, they said, call me. I mean it. I took the card and slipped it into my pocket, unsure if I'd ever use it. But their words lingered in my mind long after they were gone, like the faint echo of a song you can't quite remember the lyrics to. The next few days were a blur of routine and reflection. I kept going to the job training program, pushing myself to stay focused even when my thoughts wandered back to the conversation I'd had with my old friend. Their reappearance had stirred something in me, a mix of hope and unease that I couldn't shake out one night. As I lay on the thin mattress in the shelter, I pulled out the card they'd given me. The name and number were printed neatly, along with the name of an organization I didn't recognize. I turned it over in my hands, debating whether to call. Part of me wanted to reach out, to see if their offer of help was genuine. But another part of me, the part that had grown accustomed to disappointment, hesitated. What if I called and they didn't answer? Or worse, what if they did and I realized I'd made a mistake in trusting them? In the end, I slipped the card back into my pocket and told myself I'd think about it tomorrow. The next morning, something unexpected happened. One of the program coordinators approached me with a look of cautious optimism. "There's a new opportunity," they said. "It's not a full-time job, but it's a chance to work with a local nonprofit on a short-term project. They're looking for someone with administrative skills, and your name came up." I was stunned. After months of rejection and closed doors, the idea of someone actually considering me for a position felt almost too good to be true. "What's the catch?" I asked, my skepticism slipping out before I could stop it. "No catch," they said with a small smile. "It's not much, just a few hours a week to start, but it's something. And it could lead to more if things go well." I agreed to the interview, though a part of me was already bracing for disappointment. When the day of the interview arrived, I dug through the donated clothing at the shelter to find something presentable to wear. The shirt was a little too big, and the tie was slightly frayed, but it was the best I could do. The interview itself was nerve-wracking. The interviewer was kind but professional, and I found myself fumbling over my words more than once. I was sure I'd blown it, but at the end of the meeting, they shook my hand and said they'd be in touch. As I walked back to the shelter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. For the first time in a long time, I felt a tiny flicker of hope, a fragile, delicate thing that I was almost afraid to acknowledge. But life, as always, had a way of throwing curveballs. That night, a fight broke out in the shelter. It wasn't uncommon. Tensions ran high when so many people were crammed into a small space, each carrying their own burdens. But this time, it escalated quickly. I stayed in my corner, trying to avoid the chaos, but the noise was impossible to ignore. Shouting turned into shoving, and shoving turned into something worse. By the time the staff intervened, the damage had been done. One of the men involved was asked to leave, and the rest of us were left to deal with the aftermath, a mix of frayed nerves and an even heavier sense of despair. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder if I was fooling myself. Was it really possible to rebuild a life from scratch at 50? Or was I just setting myself up for more disappointment? The next morning, I found a message waiting for me at the program office. The nonprofit had called back. They wanted to offer me the position. For a moment, I couldn't believe it. I reread the message twice, half expecting it to disappear like a mirage. But it was real. The tiny flicker of hope I'd felt earlier began to grow, warming a part of me I thought had gone cold. As I prepared for my first day at the nonprofit, I couldn't help but think of the card in my pocket, the one my old friend had given me. Maybe it was time to take another chance. Maybe, just maybe, this unexpected journey was leading me somewhere I hadn't dared to dream of yet. On my first day at the nonprofit, I arrived early, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and anxiety. The office was small but inviting, with walls covered in posters about community programs and inspirational quotes that, for once, didn't feel hollow. I was introduced to a handful of staff members, all of whom welcomed me warmly, though I could sense a hint of polite curiosity in their eyes. They didn't ask about my background or why I was here. but I could tell they were wondering. The work itself was straightforward: organizing files, answering phones, and entering data into the computer system. It felt strange to be in an office again, to have a purpose, even if it was just for a few hours a week. I threw myself into the tasks, determined to prove that I could still be reliable, still be useful. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice something unsettling. The nonprofit's director, a kind but overworked woman, began dropping hints about funding issues. Meetings grew more tense, and whispers about potential layoffs circulated among the staff. Even though my position was temporary, the thought of losing this fragile foothold terrified me. At the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that my old friend's sudden reappearance wasn't just a coincidence. They had started calling me every few days, checking in, asking how I was doing. Each conversation felt like peeling back another layer of the past, revealing wounds I thought had healed. They seemed genuinely interested in helping me, but there was an edge to their questions, a subtle probing that made me wonder if they had an agenda of their own. One evening, after another long day at the office, I finally decided to confront them. We met at a coffee shop, the kind of place I hadn't stepped foot in for years. I could barely afford a cup of tea, but they insisted on paying. "Why now?" I asked, staring at them across the table. "Why reach out after all this time?" They hesitated, looking down at their hands as if searching for the right words. "Because I heard about what happened," they said finally. "And I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." Their answer was simple, but it didn't satisfy me. Something about their tone, the way they avoided meeting my eyes, made me think there was more to the story. But before I could press further, they leaned forward, their voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something you need to know," they said. "About the nonprofit." The words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced around the coffee shop, suddenly hyper-aware of the other patrons. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice low. They hesitated again, then sighed. "I've been doing some digging. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure, but I think there's something going on there. Something they don't want you or anyone else to know." I stared at them, my mind racing. The nonprofit had been my lifeline, the one thing keeping me from slipping back into the darkness. The idea that it might be hiding something, that it might not be what it seemed, was almost too much to process. "What kind of something?" I asked, my voice trembling. Slightly. They glanced around, then leaned in closer. "I'm not sure yet, but there are discrepancies in their financial records. Money that's unaccounted for. And the director, well, let's just say she's been involved in some questionable dealings before." Their words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to dismiss them, to believe that they were wrong or exaggerating. But a part of me couldn't ignore the signs I'd already noticed: the strained meetings, the vague answers about funding, the way certain staff members avoided eye contact when I asked questions. Still, I didn't want to believe it. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you're in the middle of it," they said. "And if something goes wrong, you could get caught up in the fallout. I don't want that to happen." I didn't know what to say. I felt like the ground beneath me was shifting, like everything I'd been clinging to was slipping through my fingers. For the next few days, I couldn't focus. At work, I found myself watching the director more closely, trying to pick up on anything that might confirm or disprove what my friend had said. I noticed things I hadn't paid attention to before: the way she avoided certain topics during meetings, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. One afternoon, I overheard a hushed conversation between two senior staff members. They were talking about an upcoming audit, their voices tinged with nervousness. My stomach twisted as I realized that my friend might be right. That evening, I pulled out the card they'd given me and dialed their number. When they answered, I didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need to know everything," I said. Over the next hour, they told me everything they'd uncovered. It wasn't just financial discrepancies, there were allegations of mismanagement, conflicts of interest, and even rumors of embezzlement. The nonprofit, which had seemed like a beacon of hope, was starting to look more like a sinking ship. But the worst part was the realization that I might be a pawn in whatever was happening. If the organization went under, if the allegations came to light, I could lose the little stability I'd managed to rebuild. I spent the night lying awake, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to walk away, to cut ties with the nonprofit and distance myself from whatever trouble was brewing. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that walking away would mean giving up on the job, on the people I'd met there, and on myself. The next day, I decided to confront the director. I waited until the office was mostly empty, then knocked on her door. She looked up from her desk, her expression carefully neutral. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "I need to ask you something," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "Is everything okay with the organization? Are there problems I should know about?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or guilt. Then she smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, her tone light but strained. "Why would you think there's a problem?" I hesitated, debating how much to reveal. "I've heard some things," I said carefully, "and I just want to know the truth. If there's something going on, I need to know." Her smile faltered, and for a moment, I thought she might come clean. But then she straightened in her chair, her expression hardening. "This organization has helped a lot of people," she said firmly. "Including you. I suggest you focus on your work and leave the rest to us." Her words felt like a dismissal, but they only fueled my suspicion. As I left her office, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something big. That night, I met with my friend again. Together, we started piecing together the fragments of information we had, trying to make sense of what was happening. The deeper we dug, the more tangled the web became, and the more dangerous it felt. I knew I was stepping into risky territory, but I also knew I couldn't turn back. The nonprofit wasn't just a job to me, it was a symbol of everything I was trying to rebuild. And if it was rotten at its core, I needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. As the days passed, the tension grew. Whispers of the upcoming audit spread through the office, and the atmosphere became charged with unease. Staff members avoided eye contact, conversations hushed as I walked by. And then, one day, I found something. A file, left carelessly on a desk, filled with documents that didn't add up. The numbers were wrong, the names didn't match, and the amounts. They were staggering. I stared at the papers, my heart pounding. This was it, the proof I hadn't even known I was looking for. But as I stood there, the weight of what I'd discovered began to sink in. I was holding a secret that could unravel everything. And now, I had to decide what to do with it. My hands trembled as I held the file, my mind spinning with the implications of what I'd just found. The papers weren't just sloppy or riddled with mistakes, they were deliberate. The numbers had been manipulated, expenses falsified, and funds funneled into accounts that didn't belong to the nonprofit. It was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, but in their haste or arrogance, they had left this damning evidence out in the open. I quickly returned the file to where I'd found it, my pulse racing. Every instinct told me to grab the documents and run, but I couldn't risk someone catching me with them. Instead, I took a mental snapshot of the key details, names, numbers, account IDs. I'd have to figure out what to do with the information later. For now, I needed to act normal, like I hadn't just stumbled across what could be the organization's downfall. But as I made my way back to my desk, I noticed something unusual. The office, which had been eerily quiet all day, was now buzzing with tension. Staff members gathered in small groups, whispering to each other with expressions of worry and unease. I caught fragments of their conversations, something about a board meeting, an emergency decision, and rumors of someone being let go. It didn't take long to realize that the whispers were about me. I felt a prickle of fear at the back of my neck. Had someone seen me with the file? Or worse, had my questions to the director raised too many red flags? I tried to push the paranoia aside, but the looks people gave me, the way their conversations abruptly stopped when I walked by, made it impossible to ignore. By the end of the day, the tension had reached a boiling point. As I packed up to leave, the director herself appeared at my desk, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk for a moment?" she asked, her tone deceptively calm. I followed her into her office, my heart pounding. The door clicked shut behind me, and she motioned for me to sit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She just stared at me, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "I've been hearing some interesting things," she said finally, her voice smooth but with an edge of steel. "About you. About questions you've been asking." I forced myself to stay calm, meeting her gaze head on. "I'm just trying to understand how things work here," I said evenly. "Isn't that what you'd expect from someone who wants to help?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the gears turning in her head. "It's admirable," she said, though the word dripped with insincerity. "But I need to remind you of something. This organization operates on trust. When people start digging where they shouldn't, it undermines that trust. Do you understand?" Her words were a warning, plain and simple. But before I could respond, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll say this just once, be careful. Sometimes curiosity can lead to consequences you don't want to face." I left her office with my heart hammering in my chest. It was clear now that she suspected me, or worse, she knew what I'd found. And her warning wasn't idle. If I wasn't careful, I could lose not only my job but also the fragile progress I'd made in rebuilding my life. That night, I called my friend and told them everything. They listened in silence, their breathing steady on the other end of the line. When I finished, they let out a low whistle. "You're in deep," they said finally. "Deeper than I thought." "What should I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause. "You need to protect yourself," they said. "If they think you're a threat, they won't hesitate to cut you loose, or worse." "Do you still have access to that file?" I hesitated, my mind flashing back to the documents. "I know where it is," I said. "But I can't take it. They'll know it was me." "You don't have to," they said. "Just get enough to prove what's going on. Photos, copies, whatever you can manage. But do it quickly. If they're onto you, your time is running out." The next day, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was quiet, the halls empty, and I used the opportunity to slip back to where I'd found the file. My hands shook as I carefully opened the drawer, relieved to find the documents still there. I used my phone to snap pictures of every page, my heart racing with every click of the camera. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder constantly, my ears straining for the sound of footsteps. But the office remained silent, and I managed to finish without incident. Or so I thought. Later that afternoon, as I was sorting through emails, I noticed an unusual message in my inbox. It was from an anonymous sender, with no subject line and no text in the body, just a single attachment. My stomach churned as I clicked on it, revealing a photo of me in the act of taking pictures of the file. I froze, my mind racing. Someone had seen me. Worse, they had proof. My phone buzzed on the desk, making me jump. It was a text from an unknown number. "We know what you're doing. Stop now, or there will be consequences." Panic surged through me as I stared at the message. Whoever was behind this wasn't bluffing. They knew what I'd found, and they weren't going to let me expose it. I forwarded the text and the photo to my friend, who called me immediately. "This changes everything," they said, their voice low and urgent. "You're not just dealing with a few bad decisions. This is a cover-up. And whoever's behind it is willing to go to great lengths to keep it hidden." "What do I do?" I asked, my voice shaking. First, you need to get out of there, they said. If they're watching you, staying at the office is too dangerous. But you also need to get those documents to someone who can help, someone who can expose the truth without putting you at risk. I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. And what if they come after me? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then you need to be ready, they said. This isn't just about your job anymore. It's about your safety. As I hung up, a cold sense of dread settled over me. I had thought the nonprofit was my way back to stability, to rebuilding my life. But now, it felt like I was caught in a web of lies and danger, with no clear way out. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. I didn't go back to the office the next day. The tension had built up too high, and after that photo and the threatening text, I couldn't risk it. Instead, I spent the morning pacing my small apartment, replaying everything in my head and wondering how I'd ended up here. I had been searching for a way to rebuild my life, to find some sense of purpose, and now I was tangled in something that could destroy me. The phone call came just before noon. It was my friend, their voice hurried and laced with urgency. I did some digging, they said. The accounts you mentioned? They're linked to a shell corporation. And guess who's listed as one of the owners? I gripped the phone tighter. The director? Exactly. It's bigger than we thought, they continued. There are multiple accounts, all tied to her and a handful of others. They've been funneling donations for years, and the amounts are staggering. This isn't just a bad decision. This is criminal. The weight of it all pressed down on me. I had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it feel more real, more dangerous. What do I do now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. You need to get those files to someone who can take action, they said. A journalist, a lawyer, someone who can protect you and expose this at the same time. But you need to act fast. If they know you have proof, they won't wait around to see what you do with it. That night, I met with a journalist my friend had connected me with. They were cautious but intrigued, their sharp eyes scanning the photos I'd taken with intense focus. This is enough to open an investigation, they said, their voice steady. But you'll need to be prepared for what comes next. They're not going to let this go without a fight. I left the meeting feeling a mixture of relief and dread. The files were out of my hands now, but that didn't mean I was safe. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and waiting. I stayed inside as much as possible, keeping my phone close and checking the locks on my door more times than I could count. Then, late one evening, everything came to a head. I was sitting in the dim light of my living room when I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't the casual knock of a neighbor or a delivery driver, it was deliberate, heavy, and insistent. My heart leapt into my throat as I crept to the peephole. On the other side stood two men I didn't recognize, dressed in plain but professional clothing. Their faces were calm, too calm, and something about their stance set off every alarm bell in my head. I didn't open the door. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called my friend. There are two men at my door, I whispered, my voice shaking. I don't know who they are, but they don't look friendly. Don't open it, they said immediately. Get out of there if you can. Take whatever you need and leave, now. I grabbed my keys and slipped out through the back door, my heart pounding. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, hidden in the shadow of an alley. From there, I called the journalist. They've sent people after me, I said, my voice trembling. I'm not safe. The journalist assured me that steps were already being taken to protect me. They had contacted authorities and shared the files, and the wheels were in motion for an investigation. But even their reassurances couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted. The next day, news broke about the nonprofit. Headlines splashed across every major outlet, exposing the corruption, the embezzlement, and the people behind it. The director's face was plastered everywhere, her carefully crafted reputation crumbling in an instant. It should have felt like a victory, but instead, it felt like the calm before the storm. And then, the twist I hadn't seen coming. As I scrolled through the news coverage, my phone buzzed with another message from the same unknown number as before. You think you've won, but this isn't over. My blood ran cold. Even with the truth exposed, they weren't done with me. And as I stared at the message, a new realization dawned: the corruption wasn't limited to the nonprofit. The shell corporations, the hidden accounts, it was part of something much bigger, something that reached further than I'd ever imagined. The battle was far from over. And now, I wasn't just fighting for justice, I was fighting to survive. The message sat on my phone like a time bomb, ticking away at my nerves. Even though the news had broken, and the truth about the nonprofit was out, the weight of that single sentence made it clear this wasn't over. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, pretending it was just an empty threat, but deep down, I knew better. The people behind this didn't play games. They'd already tried to intimidate me, and now, with everything crumbling around them, they'd be desperate. Desperation made people dangerous. I didn't sleep that night. My mind replayed everything: the files, the confrontation with the director, the strangers at my door. Every moment felt like it had led to this, a crossroads I couldn't escape. When the first rays of sunlight peeked through my window, I made a decision. I wouldn't live my life in fear. The next morning, I reached out to the journalist again. They sent me another message. I told them, "It doesn't feel like it's over." They paused, their voice steady but concerned. "This is bigger than we thought," they said. "The nonprofit was just the tip of the iceberg. We're uncovering ties to other organizations, offshore accounts. This is a network, not just a single entity." The thought made my stomach churn. What had I gotten myself into? But before I could spiral into panic, the journalist added, "You did the right thing. Exposing this was the first step, and now it's out of their hands. Authorities are involved. They're watching you because they're scared, not because they're in control." It was a comforting thought, even if it didn't erase my fear entirely. Over the next few days, the story continued to unfold in the media. More arrests were made, more names connected to the scandal. The director of the nonprofit was at the center of it all, but she wasn't the mastermind, just one of many players in a much larger game. I stayed cautious, avoiding unnecessary risks and keeping in close contact with the journalist and my friend. The police reached out to me as well, asking for a formal statement and offering protection if needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had allies, people who were working to ensure justice was served. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself looking over my shoulder. Every shadow felt like a threat, every unfamiliar face a potential enemy. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. One evening, as I sat in my small apartment scrolling through the latest news updates, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from a number I didn't recognize. My instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello?" I said cautiously. A voice on the other end, calm but unnerving, replied, "You've caused a lot of trouble." I froze, gripping the phone tightly. "Who is this?" "You should have stayed out of it," the voice continued. "But now, it's too late." Before I could respond, the line went dead. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I immediately called the police, reporting the call and forwarding the number. They assured me they were tracking it, but the uncertainty lingered. The days that followed were tense, but nothing happened. No more calls, no more messages. The media frenzy began to die down as the story shifted to legal proceedings and court cases. The nonprofit was dissolved, its assets seized, and its leadership facing charges that could put them away for years. And yet, the nagging feeling that someone was still watching me wouldn't go away. It wasn't until weeks later that I finally found some closure. I was meeting with the journalist again, going over the final pieces of the story, when they handed me a small folder. This came in from one of our sources, they said. We thought you should see it. Inside were documents that outlined the full scope of the network the nonprofit had been part of. Names, accounts, transactions, it was all there, a tangled web of corruption and greed. But what struck me most was a note attached to the folder, written in neat, precise handwriting. Thank you for bringing this to light. Your courage made this possible. I stared at the note, emotions washing over me in waves. Gratitude, relief, and a lingering sense of disbelief. For so long, I had felt like a pawn in a game I didn't understand, a target in a fight I hadn't chosen. But now, for the first time, I felt like I had made a difference. The threats stopped after that. Whether it was because the network had been dismantled or because the remaining players had decided I wasn't worth the risk, I didn't know. What I did know was that my life would never be the same. I took time to reflect on everything that had happened, the choices I'd made, and the paths they had led me down. When I first joined the nonprofit, I had been looking for stability, a way to rebuild after losing everything. What I found instead was a purpose I hadn't realized I needed. In the end, the experience taught me more than I could have imagined. It showed me the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the strength that comes from refusing to back down, even when the odds are stacked against you. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. I still faced challenges, still had moments of doubt and fear. But I also had hope, a hope that came from knowing that even in the darkest moments, it's possible to find light. As I walked out of the journalist's office for the last time, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to face it. Because I knew now that no matter how broken things seemed, there was always a way forward. And sometimes, the hardest journeys lead to the most unexpected destinations.